Hi everyone, it's Tim here. Time for November 2023's solar and energy stats. So if you're interested in the system we've got, take a look in the description, all the details are there. So let's get on with it. Okay, so this is the GivEnergy monthly report, and you can see the solar generation was pretty rubbish, 133.5 kilowatt hours. Nothing to write home about really. I'm not even going to bother dwelling on that particularly. But one interesting thing from this is finally our self-consumption is basically 100%, more or less as you'd expect. And the energy flow chart, you can see no solar, pretty much everything came from the grid. Obviously, we're topping up the battery overnight for the vast majority of the time, and then the battery is then going to support the home. A good chunk of that is the heating, which I'll show you later. But yeah, so despite the fact that solar generation was pretty low, it's more or less in line with what we would expect based on the PVGIS estimate that I've been using for this chart here. You can see the shaded area is what we would expect to generate, and in November we were just slightly below expectations, but within the plus and minus 1 standard deviation shown by the faint blue lines there. So more or less in line with what we'd expect. So there you go, not too bad after all. But if we look at the overall consumption for the month, you can see that we actually we're more or less in line with what our normal baseline is. What I've called remainder here, so that's everything that's not the all the big consumers like the EV and the heating. But you can see the EV was actually a little bit down on what we would normally tend to use, mostly because I think we had a couple of longer trips in November, which we actually used my petrol car for rather than Cat's EV. So that's why that was a little bit lower than the previous month. But you can see big chunk here now is the heating. So this is the air-to-air heat pump system that we've got, the air conditioning units that we use for our heating. And that's really starting to take off now, as you'd expect. The weather is getting a bit colder, but yeah, that's what's now starting to dominate, and that's just only going to get worse through the rest of the winter, which I'll show you in the next chart. You can see hot water a little bit more than the previous months because the water that's going in to the cylinder is a bit colder than it would have been previously in the year, so it takes a little bit more energy to heat it up. So therefore, it takes a bit more of our overall consumption. So yeah, that's more or less in line with expectation as well. One thing I've added on here that I didn't show last month was the dehumidifiers that we run. We do that mostly in the room where we tend to dry our laundry, just to stop the the humidity building up. And we've got another one down in the lounge just to keep the humidity under control. We run that when the humidity gets above about 60%, something like that, just to keep it down in a sort of comfortable region, and between 50 and 60% if we can. And the towel rails, much as before, pretty much the same in 15 kilowatt hours there in comparison to October. So as I mentioned, obviously the heating is starting to ramp up, and this is the chart that shows what we expect the heating to be roughly in each given month. This is based on my own modelling that I did last year, where I basically estimated what the heating should be on any given day based on temperature and sunlight and all that sort of stuff. So you can see actually in November, similar to October, it's a bit lower than what we would expect. I believe that actually October and November were both somewhat milder than what you would normally expect for this time of year. So that's probably why that is a little bit lower than the expectation. But again, still well within the plus or minus 1 standard deviation lines defined by these faint blue lines here. Right at the end of November, obviously it got really cold, but that was only literally for the last couple of days. So that's actually going to make more of a difference to the start of the December data, I think. But we'll see how the rest of December goes. Obviously, come back next month to find out what happens. But we shall see. But for November and October, certainly, I think it was a little bit milder, so we used a little bit less heating, but nothing extremely unusual. Well within what we would normally expect given the time of year. So this is the monthly estimated savings that I calculate based on our consumption and also various other bits and bobs like what the gas use would have been for all the heating and things like that, and the hot water. So basically what I'm assuming is that if we didn't have the solar and the heat pump system and the EV, then we would have used gas for the hot water and gas for the central heating, and petrol for the car. So what would the cost have been if we didn't have the system? And that's what I call the equivalent cost here. And then I show the actual bill in red. So the two sort of open boxes here, those are the two contributions that I then use to calculate the estimated total savings. So it's basically the combination of these two things give the solid blue boxes here, which is what I then estimate to be the savings that we've made because we've got the equipment that we have. So the solar, the battery, the heat pump and the EV. So last month I said I suspected that the total estimated savings would start ticking up as we go through the winter. Now the November value is a little bit lower than October, whereas my thought was that it would start to go up again. Now I think partly that is due to the fact that we had such a low EV use in November compared to October, and therefore the savings from the EV are down on what they were in October. So if we'd used the EV as much as we had in October, I think this number would be very slightly higher than the October number. However, my original hypothesis was that this would continue to tick up again into December and January. I'm now not so sure that's going to be the case, because what I'm finding now is that we're starting to use more and more peak power to run the heating system. Now, because I've been quite generous towards the gas central heating system and in my calculations I've said that we would need 3 times as much gas in terms of kilowatt hours to run the heating if we were to use a gas central heating system compared to the air-to-air heat pump system. In actual fact, that results in, I think, it being slightly more expensive to run the heating during the peak period compared to running it using off-peak power. So what we do is we fill up our battery overnight using off-peak power, and that runs the heating for as long as it can, but we're finding inevitably that the battery runs out sometime during the day, and we have to then start using peak power to run the heating. Now, because peak power is more than 3 times more expensive than gas for the same number of kilowatt hours, that means that my conversion between kilowatt hours for heating using the heat pump system and kilowatt hours used for gas results in running the heat pump system during the peak period is therefore more expensive than if we were to use gas. So it all depends on exactly how much peak power we have to use on any given day. So on days where we're only just using a little bit of extra peak power to run the heat pump system, probably we're still running the heating cheaper than we would if it was running with gas. But on days when it's super cold and we're using loads more peak power to run the heat pump, that inevitably makes those days more expensive than if we'd run using a gas central heating system. So it all depends on exactly what happens during December and January. How much peak power are we going to use, and therefore how much of an impact is that going to make on the effective running cost of the heating system? So that's going to be an interesting calculation to do. And in fact, I've started to gather that data. I'm not going to show you just yet. I'm going to gather a couple of months worth of data before I start showing you that detailed information. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, and it also then goes into the question of whether or not getting extra battery capacity would be worthwhile. So if we had a bigger battery, we'd be able to charge it up more, assuming we could actually charge it up more. And there's another question regarding that, because at the moment we're on Octopus Go, which only has 4 hours of off-peak period, which means that we're only just able to fill up our current capacity of about 14 kilowatt hours in that 4-hour block. If we were to get additional battery, we wouldn't be able to fill it up because there just wouldn't be time. However, if we were able to move on to something like Intelligent Go, then we would have an additional 2 hours where we could fill up an additional extra capacity of the battery. So if we were to buy, say, an additional 5 kilowatt hours of battery, we could fill that up and then use that to help support the heating system, and therefore use less peak power, and therefore the cost of the heating would then come down, obviously. So the calculation I'm going to do at the end of the winter is to work out whether or not that would be worthwhile, and I'll go into more details about that at the end of the winter. But next month I'll show you a couple of months of the data that I'm gathering in order to answer that question, and I think it's going to be an interesting question to answer, and will certainly dictate whether or not we actually go ahead and purchase additional battery capacity at some point next year, perhaps. So yeah, that's it for this month's stats. Hope you enjoyed that and got something useful from it. Feel free to use my referral code if you are not yet with Octopus Energy and would like to use Octopus for your energy supplier. If you use my referral code, you'll get £50 credit to your account when you join, and I'll also get £50 credit. So that helps me stay motivated and make more of these videos. So I certainly appreciate those people who have been doing that already. So thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.